Cuba is not large, but history echoes here louder than in nations 10 times its size. It is a sliver of land between oceans, where hurricanes, conquistadors, and ideologies have all made landfall, where African drums echo in Catholic cathedrals, where sugar built cities, slavery paid for empires, and revolution became both religion and export. Before colonizers, it was a place of peace. Then came gold fever, war fleets, and disease. Cuba became the crown jewel of the Spanish Caribbean, rich, blood-soaked, and restless. And when Spain fell, another empire stepped in. Flags changed, foreign hands remained. This is a country where rebellion is generational, where the machete became a weapon of both harvest and insurrection, where Fidel and Che didn't just seize power, they rewrote what a nation could be, where the Cold War turned hot at the shoreline, and survival meant outlasting embargo, exile, and silence. But Cuba is not frozen. It adapts. It sings through blockade. It finds rhythm in ruin. So how did one island, battered and besieged, become one of the most symbolically charged places on Earth? This is the story of how Cuba was shaped, by soil, by smoke, by struggle, and why the world still watches every move it makes. Cuba's story begins not with sails on the horizon, but with tectonic drift and ocean currents. The island itself is the fractured offspring of ancient continents, wedged between the North American and Caribbean plates, pushed upward by submarine collisions, and sculpted by eons of erosion and upheaval. Its shape, long and lean like a sleeping crocodile, sits perfectly between two worlds, the Atlantic and the Gulf, the Americas and the Antilles. This geography would become both blessing and curse. Fertile soils, rich coastlines, but also a strategic choke point that empires would kill to control. Long before colonizers renamed its coasts, Cuba was called Caubana by the Taino, one of several indigenous Arawak-speaking peoples who migrated north from South America in dugout canoes. By the first millennium CE, they had established a vibrant island culture, agricultural, communal, and spiritually rooted in the land. They grew cassava and tobacco, wove hammocks, crafted polished stone tools, and honoured zimis, carved ancestral spirits said to live in caves, rivers, and trees. The Taino didn't build pyramids, they built balance. Their world was cyclical, not imperial. They had no standing armies, no need for conquest. But geography doesn't ask for conquest, it invites it. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed on Cuba's eastern shore and declared it Spanish property, though he believed it to be mainland Asia. What followed was not just colonization, it was obliteration. Within a generation, the Taino population had collapsed under the weight of disease, forced labor, and violence. Their names survive, in rivers, cities, mountains, but their society was dismantled almost overnight. The Spanish called the island the key to the New World, and they meant it literally. Whoever held Cuba could command the shipping lanes of the entire Caribbean. Cuba became a military outpost, a supply station, a staging ground for conquest on the mainland. But underneath the stone forts and planted flags, the land still remembered. The rivers still flowed. The soil still grew tobacco sweet and sugarcane tall. And even in the ashes of the Taino world, new rhythms were beginning to emerge, carried in chains, sung in code, soon to define everything that followed. Because Cuba would not stay a garrison, it was about to become a machine of wealth and resistance. By the 16th century, Cuba was no longer just a stopover. It was a colony being built from the ground up, and from the ground came sugar. The Spanish cleared forests and carved plantations into the fertile plains. At first, the labour came from what was left of the Taino, but they did not survive long under the lash and disease. So Spain turned to Africa. The transatlantic slave trade would reshape Cuba forever. Over 800,000 enslaved Africans were brought to the island between the 16th and 19th centuries, many more than the number of Spaniards who ever settled there. These men, women and children carried no swords. but they carried language, religion, rhythm, and resistance. They did not come to Cuba willingly, but Cuba became theirs in ways the empire never fully understood. Plantations grew vast. Sugar became king. By the late 1700s, Cuba was one of the world's largest sugar exporters, a golden prize for Spain's crumbling empire. Havana, once a sleepy port, boomed into a fortified capital, lined with Baroque churches and colonial mansions, its harbour crowded with merchant ships and war galleons. But the wealth was not Cuban. It flowed outward, to Madrid, to investors, to absentee landowners. Power remained in foreign hands, profits in foreign coffers. Inside the system, life was brutal. Enslaved people worked under tropical heat from dawn to dusk. Punishments were public. Rebellions were common. Music became code. Religion became camouflage. Santeria, an Afro-Cuban faith-blending Yoruba orishas with Catholic saints, emerged from this fusion, a spiritual rebellion under colonial watch. And yet by the 19th century, even the colonists were restless. Creole elites, Spanish by blood but Cuban by birth, began to chafe under Madrid's grip. They wanted trade freedom, political voice and local power. But Spain clung tighter. Elsewhere in the Americas, revolution was erupting. Haiti had overthrown its colonial masters. Simón Bolívar was marching through the continent. But in Cuba, the uprising would come slower and bloodier. In 1868, a sugar planter named Carlos Manuel de Céspedes freed his enslaved workers and called for independence. This launched the 10 Years' War, a brutal guerrilla conflict that left fields burned, towns razed, and families shattered. It failed, but it lit a fuse. More uprisings followed, more repression. Spain sent troops. Rebels retreated to the jungles and mountains. The machete, used to cut cane, became a weapon of war. Cuba, once the engine of empire, had become its battlefield. By the late 1800s, after centuries of wealth and ruin, the island stood at a breaking point. Spanish rule was exhausted, the people were not. And into this volatile brew stepped another empire, newer, richer, and waiting just off the coast. The United States, watching, waiting, ready. By the 1890s, Cuba was in full revolt. The island had spent decades in a cycle of rebellion and repression. Fields were scorched, cities fortified. Spain, weakened and unwilling to reform, cracked down harder. Hundreds of thousands of rural Cubans were herded into reconcentration camps. Starvation and disease followed. The world watched. Enter José Martí, poet, exile, revolutionary. From New York, he rallied support, raised funds, and preached a vision of Cuba with all and for the good of all. Not just free from Spain, but free from domination, foreign or domestic. In 1895, Martí returned to the island and joined the guerrilla war. He died in battle soon after, but his words became sacred scripture for Cuban nationalism. By 1898, the war had become uncontainable. Then an American battleship, the USS Maine, exploded in Havana Harbor under mysterious circumstances. The US blamed Spain. War followed. It was short, one-sided, and decisive. But Cuba's victory wasn't Cuban. Spain surrendered to the United States. The Cuban rebels were sidelined. In 1902, Cuba was granted formal independence, but under conditions written in Washington. The Platt Amendment gave the US the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, oversee treaties, and maintain a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba was free on paper, but functionally a protectorate. The early 20th century saw the rise of the Cuban Republic, a fragile state propped up by sugar exports and American capital. US companies bought plantations, railroads, and utilities. American Marines landed multiple times to restore order. Elections were held, but power pooled in the hands of sugar barons, generals, and corrupt politicians. Still, Havana glittered. By the 1920s and 30s, it was the vice capital of the Caribbean. Casinos, rum, jazz, and political deals done over cigars and bourbon. Gangsters like Meyer Lansky made Havana their playground. Tourists came for the beaches, but stayed for the bribes. The profits flowed northward. But Cuba's golden age was not for Cubans. Land was concentrated. Rural poverty deepened. Urban slums spread. Afro-Cubans remained marginalised. The Republic's elite wore silk, but ruled with police batons. Between elections came coups. And in 1952, a familiar face returned with tanks. Fulgencio Batista. Once a populist soldier, now a US-backed dictator, Batista suspended the constitution and invited the mafia to expand. He promised order. What he delivered was surveillance, torture, and theft on an industrial scale. And in the mountains of eastern Cuba, a new rebellion stirred. Young, radical, armed, led by a lawyer in fatigues with a beard and a vision. Fidel Castro. The Republic's gilded mask had cracked, and the next revolution would not ask permission. By the early 1950s, Cuba had become a paradox. To outsiders, Havana glowed with music and modernity, a Caribbean Las Vegas backed by US dollars. But beneath the neon, dictatorship, debt, and despair. Half the population lived in poverty. Rural children died from parasites. Police beat confessions out of teenagers. Batista ruled from behind mirrored sunglasses, sustained by bribes and bullets. Then came 1953, and a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago. Fidel Castro, barely 27, led the assault. It failed. Dozens were killed. He was arrested. But in court, he gave a 4-hour speech that electrified the nation. Its final line, "History will absolve me." He was exiled. He returned. And by 1956, with Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and a ragtag group of revolutionaries, Fidel landed back in Cuba aboard a leaky yacht named Granma. Hunted by Batista's army, they fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, launching a guerrilla war fueled by radio broadcasts, land reform promises, and machete-wielding peasants. For 2 years, the revolution spread like fire. Students bombed cities, workers struck, soldiers defected. Batista, bloated by corruption, crumbled. On January 1st, 1959, he fled the country. The rebels marched into Havana, Che in fatigues, Fidel in olive drab. The crowds roared. But this wasn't a return to the Republic. It was a rejection of the entire system. Fidel nationalised land, seized foreign assets, and declared an end to oligarchy. At first, the revolution was not explicitly communist. It was nationalist, anti-imperialist, homegrown. But as the US imposed sanctions and froze assets, Fidel leaned east, toward the Soviet Union. In 1961, Cuba officially declared itself socialist. Private businesses were seized. The press was silenced. Opposition fled or vanished. 1.5 million Cubans would eventually leave, many to Miami, forming an exile community that watched Cuba through tears and rage. Washington panicked. In April 1961, CIA-trained exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion collapsed in 3 days. Humiliated, the US tightened its grip. Fidel tightened his. The next year, the world held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought humanity to the brink of nuclear war. Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba. The US imposed a naval blockade. For 13 days, the planet teetered on annihilation. Then a backroom deal. The missiles were removed. The world exhaled. But Cuba emerged transformed, a symbol of defiance, a proxy in a Cold War, a flashpoint that could incinerate the planet. Through the 1960s and 70s, Cuba exported doctors and revolution. It sent troops to Angola, advisors to Latin America, teachers across the Third World. Its literacy rate soared, healthcare improved, infant mortality dropped. A small island had become a global player by aligning itself with Moscow and by offering an alternative model to the capitalist hemisphere. But there was a cost. Political dissent was crushed. Gay Cubans were interned. Neighbourhood committees monitored speech. The economy, built on Soviet subsidies and sugar exports, lacked innovation. The revolution fed minds, but often emptied shelves. Still, for many, Cuba became more than a country. It became a myth of resistance, survival, and moral clarity. And as the Cold War began to thaw, Cuba stood isolated but unbowed. Until in 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared, and Cuba was alone again. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 hit Cuba like a hurricane with no wind. Everything stopped. Trade collapsed. Fuel vanished. Shelves emptied. The island plunged into what Fidel euphemistically called the special period in time of peace. It was special. It was catastrophic. GDP shrank by over 35%. Blackouts became daily ritual. Bicycles replaced buses. People lost £20 on average. Cats and pigeons disappeared from city streets. Soap was bartered. Toothpaste was homemade. University professors moonlighted as cab drivers. Families turned rooftops into gardens. Hospitals operated without anaesthesia. For a revolution that promised dignity, it was humiliation. And yet, Cuba did not collapse. Fidel adapted. Slowly, reluctantly, he opened cracks in the system. US dollars were legalized. Remittances from exiles were permitted. Tourism, once condemned as colonial vice, became salvation. Foreign hotels were built. Classic cars and mojitos were packaged as nostalgia. Cuba began selling its revolution as an aesthetic. The economy partially stabilized, but with new tensions. A dual currency system created a class divide. Those with access to tourist money lived better, while many still waited in ration lines. Doctors moonlighted as bellboys. Engineers poured drinks for Canadians. The revolution survived by bending, but never breaking. Through the 2000s, Hugo Chávez's Venezuela stepped in with subsidized oil. Cuba exported doctors in exchange. Meanwhile, Fidel's health declined. In 2006, he ceded power, first temporarily, then permanently, to his brother Raúl Castro. Raúl introduced measured reforms, limited private business, relaxed travel restrictions, and a cautious thaw with the US. Under President Barack Obama, relations warmed dramatically. Embassies reopened, direct flights resumed, Airbnbs appeared. For a brief moment, it felt like a new chapter might begin, but the system never fully let go. Political control remained tight. The press remained state-run. Dissidents were still harassed. The ideological script held firm: socialismo o muerte. And when Trump reversed the thaw, tightened sanctions, and added Cuba back to the list of state sponsors of terrorism, the economy reeled again. Then came COVID-19, crippling tourism, choking remittances, and exposing the island's vulnerabilities. In 2021, something rare happened. Nationwide protests erupted over blackouts, medicine shortages, and the slow suffocation of daily life. People chanted "Libertad." The government responded with arrests, internet blackouts, and televised warnings, but the chants lingered. Today, Cuba is suspended between past and future. The revolution still frames national identity, but its architects are fading. Raúl Castro stepped down. Fidel is gone. A new generation governs, but the old slogans remain. Yet walk the streets of Havana, and you'll see something else. Teenagers rapping over Wi-Fi hotspots, rooftop gardens beside crumbling colonial mansions, Santeria altars beside socialist murals, old Che tattoos faded on arms holding smartphones. Cuba is still inventing itself. In music, in medicine, in memory. The state endures, so does the spirit of defiance. But the model is strained. The question is no longer if Cuba will change, it's how long it can wait. Cuba today is a nation in tension. Its streets are loud with history, its people quiet with fatigue. The revolution still looms over every institution, its heroes painted on school walls, its slogans echoed in morning assemblies. But the weight of that legacy now sits heavily on a generation that didn't choose it. Economically, Cuba is in a slow-motion freefall. The dual currency system has been dismantled, but inflation gallops. Tourists trickle in, but nowhere near the numbers needed. Fuel shortages trigger hours-long blackouts. Medicines vanish from pharmacies. Supermarkets echo. Doctors still lead global humanitarian missions, but at home, clinics struggle to find syringes. Culturally, however, Cuba remains electric. Afro-Cuban music thrives, from reggaeton to rumba, blending Yoruba rhythms with auto-tuned urgency. Underground filmmakers and artists push against censorship with coded brilliance. Internet access, once a luxury, is now a daily tool, despite surveillance. Cubans navigate firewalls with VPNs and ingenuity, turning limited connection into global expression. Politically, the state remains rigid. The Communist Party is still the only legal party, and dissent is still monitored, detained, or disappeared. But protests no longer hide in whispers. In July 2021, thousands took to the streets, chanting not just for food and power, but for freedom. That moment has not vanished. It simmers. Meanwhile, Cuba is watching the world change. Climate threats loom. Rising seas endanger low-lying coasts, and hurricanes strike harder, fueled by warming oceans. Urban infrastructure, already cracked and corroded, struggles to withstand each blow. Emigration surges, not in rafts but in legal channels. Tens of thousands leave yearly, not in defiance but in exhaustion. And yet Cuba endures, not just because of government policy or ideology, but because of resilience woven into the culture itself. Family networks span continents. Music spills from doorways despite blackout silence. History is kept alive in rum-soaked ballads, but also challenged in poetry slams and protest art. Cuba is more than its state. It is an ecosystem of survival and reinvention, part socialist relic, part post-colonial warning, part global inspiration. No other country so small has carried so many conflicting meanings for so many people. Today, the question facing Cuba is not just economic or political, it is existential. Can a nation built on defiance reinvent itself without erasing its soul? The answer may not come quickly, but it will come, because nothing on this island stays quiet forever. Cuba has survived empires, embargoes, invasions, and isolation. Its soil is layered with rebellion, rhythm, and resilience. And though the world keeps waiting for its final act, Cuba may yet surprise us by writing a future no one has scripted before.